All right. Welcome everyone to the For the Love of Language podcast. I'm EJ,
And I'm Stacy. Welcome in, everyone.
and today we're going to talk about animal sounds.
Which is very funny because I think we've talked previously about animals and their capability of linguistic ability. But if we haven't, I guess today's the day.
Right. I think we've mentioned in passing, like dolphins and bees and stuff. I was kind of
hmm
more thinking along the lines of like in English, we say that a dog says woof or a dog barks, and in Russian, a dog says gaf. And, every language has their different ways of representing the sounds that the animals make.
Yeah. So that's kind of the direction we're going to go with this subject and talking about why there are different why different languages use different like words for animal sounds. And the answer is actually pretty simple, but like it's really fascinating when you think about it. So this is something that we've mentioned before, but it all comes back to the phonetic inventory of the language.
What's a phonetic inventory, Stacey?
Great question, EJ. Let's talk about it. So the phonetic inventory is basically all of the sounds that are available to a language, all of the sounds that they use in that language. So English happens to have like a lot of consonants, and it's very like phonetically dense, as opposed to something like Hawaiian, which is not as like phonetically dense. So we've talked a little bit about in the past. I've mentioned this example a lot, but like the famous song Melakaliki Maka is the Hawaiian, I'm using air quotes right now, Hawaiian word for Merry Christmas, because they don't have the words like R, and so they don't have like a few of the consonants, and they don't have a few of the like specific vowels. And so the closest you can get is mele, which is, Merry, Kaliki Maka, which is supposed to be Christmas, right?
And the other thing that's playing a role there is also the morphological rules in
Yeah.
Hawaiian and
And
the
syllable structure.
syllable structure. Yeah, because in Hawaiian you don't have consonant clusters. And I think
Yes.
their syllable structure is actually strictly CV, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
So,
Consonant vowel.
right, consonant vowel, which means that you can't end a syllable with a consonant.
hmm
Consonants are only syllable initial, and it also means you can't have any consonant clusters. And
hmm
so if you have like Christmas, Chris, that first syllable, you have a k sound, the C followed
hmm
by the R, if we're talking
hmm
about the letters in the word when you spell it, which does not always align well with the actual phonology or the phonetics of the word, but it's
Yeah.
a little easier to talk about. So in Hawaiian, you can't have that combination, so you have to split it up into
hmm
separate syllables or leave some of those letters out.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where you get the mele kaliki, because the Christmas gets broken up into the kele. Anyway, it gets broken up, and there are very strategic ways that languages do this. So that's an example of like borrowing, but that involves like the phonetic inventory. But with like animal sounds, it's a similar principle, but it's generated like within the language itself. So it's not necessarily a borrowing.
Mm.
People are just using the sounds that are available to them to describe what this animal sounds like.
Yeah.
And so it varies from language to language because they're only going to use the sounds that they have, and whatever sound is they think is closest to the sound that the animal's making, they're gonna like incorporate, right? So like
Mhm.
in English, we say that a rooster goes cock-a-doodle doo, but in other languages, it does not do that because that's like a lot of syllables, and like a combination like doodle is like a very weird thing that is like is not super common to have like an L final word. And so you're not going to find something like that. So that's basically kind of like what it boils down to. But maybe we
Yeah.
can like share some fun examples.
Yeah, I'd love to share some examples. And I think let's also like dive into that phonetics bit a little bit more because I think a
Yeah.
lot of our listeners are probably not super familiar with like phonemes and allophones and how that actually plays into the word choice or the letter sound choice that you have for representing the animal sounds. So maybe we can spend a minute diving into that first, if that's all right.
Yeah, yeah. We've explained this before, but you know, it always is good for a refresher. The phonetics are like the actual sounds that bubble up out of your mouth, and then the phonology is how kind of your brain organizes it. So if we're going back to the Hawaiian example, the phonology is that like, oh, it's got to be consonant, vowel, and then the phonetics is like, okay, like L and R are, you know, produced relatively the same. And so they're going to be more equivalent than like R and T. And so L makes the most sense as like a replacement for R because of the way that it's produced. So
Right.
there's like a very clear like phonetic correlation in a borrowing example like Hawaiian.
You also have just that like different languages, and we talked a little bit about the phonetic inventory, but what that
Mm-hmm.
actually means is that the fundamental sounds that each language uses are going to be different from each other. And so I mentioned like a phoneme. A phoneme is just like a pure differentiating sound between a language. So in order for a sound to be classified as a phoneme, there's a really basic test that linguists usually do. And
Mm-hmm.
that's saying that if you have the exact same word and you just change this one sound to another sound, and that changes the actual meaning of the word, then that means that it's a phoneme. The sound is actually distinguished from another sound. Versus if you have two sounds that can be used like interchangeably in a language and don't change the meaning of the word. But maybe in a different language, those are phonemes, but in this language, they don't change the meaning at all. Then, even though they might technically be different sounds, we call those allophones because they're not, part of that strict phonetic inventory that alters the meanings of the words. And so, in that Hawaiian example, the sound that we make with the letter R is not a phoneme for them. Like it doesn't exist in isolation in the Hawaiian language. And that's why they have to replace it with a different sound that they actually use, in
Mm-hmm.
this case, the L sound.
Yeah. So to give a couple examples of what EJ was talking about, an example of contrastive phonemes would be something like cat and bat. Cat and bat, they both have like the same ending, right? That like A T sound that we very well know. But all you do is change the first level, the first level, the first. All you do is change that first letter, that first sound from the k sound to the b sound, and all of a sudden you have two different words, as opposed to something like butter. So you can say butter or you can say butter. It doesn't change the meaning of the word having that flap and or a solid T. It's just a variation of a way that you can say it. So that's an example of allophony, or having allophones of the same phoneme.
And sometimes that'll be a little bit controversial because
Yeah.
sometimes allophones are related to accents and dialects. Like a really
Mm-hmm.
classic one where I live in Utah, people make a really big deal about saying mountain instead of mountain. And that's actually not specific to Utah, that the T sound is replaced with a glottal stop. There's some vowel changes that are a little bit more specific to Utah
Uh-huh.
there.
It's a sociolinguistic thing. It's more of an interesting phenomenon that Utahns are like hyper fixated on it. So that's more interesting, that there's a hyper fixation as opposed to just the fact that people pronounce it as mountain, or mountain. Like everyone in the U.S. says mountain because it's It's
Right.
just easier.
Unless they're being like really awkward and explicitly thinking about how they're talking or like
Yeah.
trying to read the letters. Like there are instances when people will say mountain,
Hmm.
but much more broadly across the US, people will replace that T with a glottal stop, which is
Hmm.
that kind of like pause in the middle of the word there is actually a glottal consonant.
Hmm.
And so that's an example of that glottal stop and that T are actually in some ways allophones of the same sound in English, you could argue. Or a couple other examples, in Spanish, the B sound and the V sound are generally mixed up and seen as the same because they're not really distinguished. There's not words where that's used as a contrasting feature. They do
Yeah.
have those two letters in their alphabet, but they're not actually really said differently in most dialects.
Yeah, and so just to kind of like play off of that, so in Spanish you will get pronunciations that sound like b and sound like v, and then in other instances you'll also get what's called a bilabial fricative, which is a combination of both, which sounds kind of like v. Um, and so, but they're all kind of like we said, allophones of the same phoneme. So in English they're not contrastive, or they are contrastive, but in Spanish you can even just like blend the sounds together and it's perfectly acceptable
Yeah.
in some varieties of Spanish, of course.
And I think, both those examples, like Hawaiian and Spanish, we gave examples of, times where we have contrastive phonemes in English that aren't contrastive in another language.
Hmm.
It goes the same way. There's languages that have phonemes that are contrastive that English does not have. So, for example, in Russian, there's two distinctive variations of in English what I'll describe as the SH sound, the sh sound.
Hmm.
There's two separate variations of that in Russian that can actually change, the meaning of a word. Or, in Arabic, you have a bunch of sound distinctions that we don't have in English as well.
Yeah, with a lot of pharyngeal sounds. Another example is in Hindi, and some like Indian languages. They have contrastive aspiration. So you could say pitter patter, or you could say pitter bitter patter. And so you can have like depending on how much you aspirate your consonants will is contrastive in that language. So there's a bunch of things that can vary across languages.
Yeah. And so when you're trying to describe the sounds that an animal makes, like sometimes we think of them as onomatopoeias, like, we're just saying the sound that we're hearing. Well, the language that you speak is actually very highly influential in
Yeah.
how you're describing that sound still. And that's how, in English, we end up with quack and cock-a-doodle-doo and woof, when in other
Hmm.
languages, they're going to describe those sounds super, super differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So EJ, maybe we should do a little dive into some of the different ways that languages will describe animal sounds.
Yeah, what do you want to go into?
Not gonna lie, I have to refresh my memory here a little bit on the French ones. Ah, yes, the classic. So EJ, what sound does the pig make in English?
Oink.
Okay, what sound does the pig make in Russian?
I have to look that up.
The sound that the pig makes in French is quack 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 quack. So you have like a G sound, and then you have your like nasalized vowel, and then and it's like an N. So it's similar to oink oink because it's that wah
Mhm.
wah sound, but you say quack quack.
So, according to masterrussian.com, which I don't know anything about this website, but it seems to have a bunch of sounds of animals in Russian, the pig makes the hru hru sound.
Ah,
So, quite
very nice.
different from oink.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, what sound, EJ, what sound does the cat make?
In English, meow.
Meow.
And it's funny actually that I don't just say meow, like I have to say meow.
Meow. Yep, you say meow. Do you know that one in Russian off the top of your head?
This site says meow meow, which is very similar.
Hmm. In French, you say meow, so it's very similar, or you say ron ron for like a purr, which I think is super cute.
Yeah. Cock-a-doodle-doo. I'm finding kukariaku in Russian, which is kind of cool. So these are a lot of
That
interesting.
one's very similar to the French one, which is cocorico.
So actually kind of funny. My son goes to daycare and he's actually come back knowing a bunch of animal noises. So we were like reading a book with him recently and we definitely had not taught him these words at all, but he like
Hmm.
pointed to a donkey in the background in the picture book and was like, "Donkey, yeehaw." And I
Aw.
was very, very surprised, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah. No, it's super fun. It's super fun. Oh, and then there's the classic dog. In English, dogs go bow wow or woof, and
Mhm.
in French, dogs go woof woof,
Yeah, I think I mentioned in Russian that one is gaf gaf.
guff guff, woof
Yeah.
woof woof.
One of my dogs just barked in the background very chirotically.
They knew that we were talking about them.
Definitely.
But yeah, you can find videos all over like TikTok or YouTube of people like comparing their animal sounds with one another. And it's always super interesting to see how they differ and how they're similar. And something that you can pay attention to is not only like the consonants, like using like the gaf sound in Russian for like the wolf, or just going right into a w sound like in English. So the consonants will definitely stick out, but even like look at like the vowel structure. So
Mhm.
like in French, lots of like nasal sounds that are being used in like the animal sounds, as opposed to like English, which would prefer like diphthongs or just like more pure consonants, pure vowels that aren't like nasalized and stuff. So even just seeing how like the vowels will shift can tell you a lot about the language itself. Because when you're looking at these like onomatopoeia type words, it's really like showcasing what kinds of sounds are people like picking out in like nature and then interpreting with their language. So it's actually a really cool exercise to kind of investigate what the phonetic inventories of these languages are.
Yeah, actually, that makes me think. I don't know if you remember the song "What Does the Fox Say?"
Ah, yes. Yak, yak,
This
yak, yak,
was
yak, yak,
like,
yak, yak.
right, this was like a super popular song for a little bit when I think it came out in 2013.
Yeah, it was like ages ago now.
Right, by the Norwegian comedy duo Ylvis. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. It's Ylvis.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's
but
right.
yeah, it's like a hilarious song explicitly about animal noises because you have all of these animals saying different sounds, but at least in English, it's like I couldn't tell you what sound a fox says. Like that's not in my normal group of sounds. Like, a lot of kids learn the basic cow, horse, dog, cat, but for some reason we don't think about that
We
with
forget about
foxes.
the beautiful fox.
And we actually, it's interesting because, if you said lion, someone would probably naturally just say like rawr or something.
Hmm.
But we have more foxes in the US than we have lions.
Oh
Like
yeah.
we have lions in the zoo.
Hmm.
But we don't have just like a natural way to describe the sound a fox says.
Yeah, it's really interesting because animals like hyenas or foxes, they have like sounds that don't necessarily equivalate to something linguistic, which is really like unique. Like when you say, "Oh, what does a hyena say?" You say, "Oh, the hyena laughs." That's not a
Or
like
cackles.
linguistic feature. Yeah, that's not like a something that contains linguistic meaning. It contains like, social meaning, of course, but it's not something that inherently contains like linguistic meaning. And foxes have a somewhat similar sound to hyenas in that they kind of bark, squeak. They sound kind of like a bird kind of a thing, but it's like really hard to pinpoint because that's not something that has like a linguistic interpretation, right? Like moo sounds very like some it sounds more like a word than like does, right? And
But we still say, tweet for a bird or quack for a duck, and those are also
right.
very different. And if you're actually
Yeah.
listening to, those birds or even to a dog, my dog is like barking, howling. One like two of my dogs are half husky, and one of them will actually make a really broad array of sounds.
Oh yeah, huskies are very vocal.
Right? They actually call it talking with huskies. It's like a pretty common thing to say that huskies talk, which is fascinating.
Hmm.
But we still say, the dog barks and it says woof and bow wow. But I
Yeah,
think
I
it's
mean,
partly
I think we've come up on an interesting like distinction. There's definitely we've been talking about like the onomatopoeia version of the animal sounds, but then we do have like separate words for just the sound that the animal makes in general, right?
like to
So
verb the sound,
yeah,
right?
to verb the sound. And I think if we find like cross linguistically, we're going to find that those are very, very different from the onomatopoeia version. So the onomatopoeia version across languages, and we kind of saw this in our examples, they're going to be very similar because we understand like the way that the sound like the way that the sound is like interpreted through our phonetic system, but then once you try to like verb it, then we have to kind of like switch things up and things are going to vary from like language to language. So
And
you're
then you're
probably
more
not going to say,
using existing words in your
yeah,
language as descriptors instead of trying to imitate the sound itself.
right. So like when we're talking about the sound a mouse makes, we're going to say a mouse like squeaks, right? But that's going to be different from language to language. It's not going to necessarily be that squeak sound, right? I mean, that one's a little bit different because you have like squeak is kind of a bit of an onomatopoeia for it as well. But even think about like a bird sings or a bird tweets. Like that's a little bit different from like saying cock-a-doodle-doo. So it is kind of like interesting that once you try to verb a sound, it's gonna be a bit of a different thing than just the onomatopoeia version.
I really like that you just ran with me turning the word verb into a verb.
Well, I'm sure
It
there's like
makes
a big
sense.
fancy word for it, but like to verb something is just verbifying it. Like it's
It
fine.
makes total sense. It's just like to the point.
We
But
all understand, but yeah, I'm
yeah.
there's definitely a process of, and I couldn't tell you right off the top of my head, but there's definitely a process of changing like a noun into a verb,
Mhm.
um, and then likewise there's verb not nounifying verbs, and we call that gerunding, and there's fancy words for
Mhm.
all of these things, but
But
to
verbing
verb
is just a
something,
great word. So
it's
we're going to
great,
go
it's
in with it.
accessible. We're here for
Exactly.
it.
Exactly. I do also think, that draws out some interesting other points as well. So like for the onomatopoeia form, for the just like imitating the actual sound in nature, even though languages have these different phonemes, the different sounds that are available to them to describe things, the fundamental constraint that we're seeing is actually in the physiology of the animal versus the physiology of the human. So like
Yeah.
we can't naturally make the same sounds that the animal is. So even though there are differences in, the sounds available to us, those distinctions are going to be less noted, less severe than the distinctions between like the animal and the human. And that's why, a lot of those where we're imitating the sound, even across languages, still do sound very, very similar because it's part of like the structure of your mouth and your tongue and everything. What you're capable of making also impacts that phonetic inventory that's available in different languages.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon. There's a lot of animals out there that can mimic sounds. Birds being like notorious, parrots, crows, other birds like mockingbirds are definitely they'll imitate the sounds of other birds and they'll also imitate the sounds of like other things. And there's a bunch of a bunch of different birds that can do this, but there's not a whole lot of other animals that can do that. Like birds and people are kind of unique in their ability to like recreate sounds. And it's very fascinating the way that it differs. Like as humans, we have a lot of stuff accessible to us. We have glottal sounds, we have nasal sounds, we have all these different things that we can utilize. Now, whether your language does utilize it or not, you are still physiologically capable of like reproducing a lot of these sounds. And so it's very interesting to like look at birds and how like crows or parrots will try to recreate these sounds because they don't have a lot of the same physiology that we do. And so if you hear a parrot like talk, it's doing its best to like mimic those sounds, but it has a far more limited like physiology to do so. So you'll notice that it sounds like a little bit off. Like it's pretty damn close, but like it's gonna sound a little bit different because they just have a completely different like vocal process that's available. But yeah, it's really kind of cool that there's a very small subset of creatures that can actually mimic sounds.
Which is interesting though, because the subset that can mimic sounds is much smaller than like the group of animals that can understand human sounds. Because we
Mm-hmm.
train dogs, for instance, with human language.
Yeah.
People train dolphins as well. They'll usually, use arm motions and stuff. But yeah, especially with like dogs, you'll very frequently hear someone just shout a command, like you're just using human language.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been able to teach dogs, even if they can't create those sounds, they can understand them and know that you're saying different things, which, raises a bunch of interesting questions about, animals understanding language and, is it possible for us to do the reverse and maybe understand some of animal language towards us as well? Like there's all sorts of questions and things that people have studied, and people have done
Mm-hmm.
a ton of experiments with animal language processing and understanding and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I think it serves to highlight how well developed human language is. The fact that we've been able to get these very like contrastive sounds out of our mouths that are so distinct that other animals can pick up on them. Now, granted, different animals are going to have different abilities to hear different types of contrasts, but human language is diverse enough in the variety of contrasts that we use in our vowel selections, in our consonant selections, that animals can distinguish the difference between like sit and stay. Although there are some very funny videos of dogs who are just responding to the tone of voice that you use as opposed to like the actual sounds that you use. But of course, it's going to vary from dog to dog and the way that you train and like all this stuff. But the fact that they can pick up on those cues is incredible, and I think it speaks to not only like the intelligence of the animal and their capacity for like understanding those things, but also the beautiful contrastive ability of human language to be able to communicate like certain things with such intricacy.
Yes.
Intricacy? There we
Yes,
go.
that is
That's
a
the
word.
word. It was like, that is a word. It's just not coming out right.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we just dove into like a ton of different angles and tangents on animal noises. Is there anything that you would add?
I mean, I guess I would add that, we've been highlighting like animal noises because those are very like common onomatopoeias, but like you'll definitely see this in other onomatopoeias too, like in boom, crash, bang, sizzle, pop, like all of these other different onomatopoeias that we use to describe things. Like you're going to find very similar stuff going on in different languages that just kind of mimics the phonetic inventory. So I think the stuff that we've been talking about isn't limited to like animal stuff. We've just used the animal sounds because like they're accessible and they're fun, and people like know them and they like talk about them as opposed to being like, what is your onomatopoeia for crash, or like the sound that it makes when a plate breaks. It's like, oh no, just say what does the cow say.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of this applies elsewhere too. I think that's just what I'll end with is like it's a really interesting like thought experiment and linguistic overview. Like you can definitely learn a lot about a language based just on their onomatopoeias and animal sounds, and it's kind of an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really great call out that this does apply to all sorts of onomatopoeias. And I also want to call out that I don't think we've messed up the word onomatopoeia at all during this podcast, despite saying it so many times. I know we've messed up
Yo,
other words, but
bravo to us. I know I can't say intricacy, but I can say onomatopoeia.
right? Words are weird. Words are hard. That's why we're
Words
here.
are hard. Long words are hard.
Right? One thing, maybe this is like a little bit of a challenge or game of sorts, but something interesting to think about next time that you're listening, next time that you're around animals and that you're hearing them, instead of just thinking of the animal sound in your language, try and listen to the actual sound that the animal is making and think about like if you were to reproduce that from scratch instead of using the word that's available in your language, would you change it? Like how would you mimic it with the sounds that you have and just consider if that would be different. I think it's an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely something to play around with. And, if you're driving in your car and you see horses or cows or something, or even like sheep, maybe just make some weird noises to yourself in the car. Who's gonna know? Nobody's gonna know. You're just in your car.
Oh my gosh, actually the night that I met my husband, this is like gonna be a super tangent. The night that I met my husband, we met at an activity. There were some like sports and stuff happening, and he got my number. We chatted, and then I left right before he did, and I didn't know that he was like not too far behind me actually. We like lived in the same like college neighborhood type thing. Anyway, I was walking with a couple of my roommates back to our apartment and I was making animal noises. I don't know how this came up, but like two of my roommates were in the acting department and I'm in linguistics. And for some reason, we're talking about animal noises. And so I was actually like making weird bird noises and stuff. And then I like turn around and see, this guy who just asked me for my number, like not far behind me, where he can like totally hear me making these weird noises.
That's adorable. He was into
Anyway,
it.
we did get married. It worked out, but you know,
You're still married. That's the other kicker is you're
we're
still
still
married.
married. Been over 7 years. But yeah, so do it in the privacy of your car, but it can also just be fun to chat about with other folks.
There you go. Yeah. Compare linguistic inventories. It's fantastic.
But yeah, I guess let's call it there. Thanks for listening. Follow us on For the Love of Language on Instagram, and we would love to hear your thoughts, comments, questions. Go ahead and reach out.
Have a good day, guys.